Hello viewers and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to announce that Fantasy Flight Games has finally released a preview article to officially reveal our upcoming second Deluxe Expansion entitled Legions of Death, which unveiled the 8th and presumably final faction to be added to Conquest LCG. We've had nothing but pure rumor and conjecture to base any speculation upon before, but we've now received our first glimpse of the Necrons, which are going to play in a radically dissimilar way to any of our 7 existing factions. And according to this article, our next deluxe box expansion is allegedly going to be available for purchase sometime within the first quarter of 2016, and if that information ends up being accurate, because these articles have certainly ended up being edited before, this means that Legions of Death may be available at retailers everywhere while the Planetfall cycle of war packs is still in the process of being released and distributed. But regardless as to when our next box expansion is eventually released, this article provides a wealth of information about our upcoming faction dispersed amidst a glut of various card spoilers that left me quite literally awestruck upon my first read. Do bear in mind that in this video, largely because of the sheer volume of spoilers, I'm only going to provide a cursory article overview only, and intend merely to share my first thoughts and initial impressions of our new faction, each of its exciting new mechanics, and all of these cards, because without having seen how the Necrons actually function in a practical tabletop way, it's difficult to gauge what exactly separates a good Necron card from bad. But still, there is plenty to be excited about, and in addition, our other existing 7 factions also appear set to receive remarkable new additions to expand each of their respective card pools as well. So rest assured that I'll be covering each of the cards introduced in this upcoming deluxe expansion in a much more thorough, far more exhaustive manner at a much later date, as we undoubtedly receive additional preview articles and, hopefully someday soon, Legions of Death sees its official release. But keeping that in mind, let's together take a first look at our quite literally enthralling new faction, the Necrons. So, similar to how the Tyranids received a unique kind of unit and a special associated command dial to facilitate the command phase planet commitment of their chosen synapse units, the Necrons also possess a mechanic radically different from that of any other faction. When you build a Necron deck, you select your constituents from not only any number of Necron and neutral cards, but you can also include common units from any of our original 7 non-Tyranid factions, but can not include any non-unit, non-Necron faction-specific card. This is meant to represent the notion that the Necrons, enigmatic mechanical constructs whom are notoriously difficult to destroy and which wield powerful Gauss weaponry capable of rendering apart their targets of gunfire at the molecular level, are intent upon swelling their ranks with thralls taken by force from each of our non-Tyranid factions. So, to be clear, this means you can choose any non-loyal, non-Tyranid unit, any neutral card, and any Necron card when it comes to building a Necron deck. In game terms, this mandatory indentured servitude is represented by the Necron player's enslavement dial. Though a Necron player can potentially include common units from all 7 of our original factions in his or her deck, at the beginning of each round's deploy phase, the Necron player must select one of the 7 possible factions on their enslavement dial, and they may only play units which belong to that faction for the remainder of that entire game round. As the article quickly moves on to indicate, there are a wide variety of card effects which all interact with and key off of this enslavement mechanic, and Necron players clearly have an enormously diverse card pool available from which to build their decks. The article also explains that a major consistent theme among Necrons is that their units are going to be more difficult than those of any other faction to destroy or remove from play, which is made manifest in the form of healing and damage removal, discard pile recursion, and a wide range of various unconventional methods for either putting Necron units into play or otherwise returning them to the battlefield after they've been destroyed. Additionally, as a means of representing the remarkable potency of Necron Gauss weaponry, they'll also possess a variety of effects which allow them to circumvent shielding or damage prevention. But with our 8th faction's premise and mechanics now thoroughly introduced, let's proceed to assess and evaluate our first several cards. So, this reveal article includes a total of 2 card fans, both filled with only partially visible cards, but also is host to a swath of individual reveals. But in starting with our completely exposed cards, our very first Necron is an army unit, the Mandragoran Immortals. It has a cost of 3 with 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, as well as 3 hit points. It has the Soldier and Saw Tech traits, the ranged keyword, and action. Sacrifice a non-Necron faction Soldier trait unit at this planet to ready this unit. Limit once per phase. So, the Saw Tech are a Necron dynasty presently presided over by Pharaon Imhotep the Stormlord, whom I'm quite curious as to whether we'll see as one of our first 2 Necron warlords. But regardless, for the price, the Mandragoran Immortals are an exceptionally durable ranged keyword unit that can potentially attack twice during a ranged skirmish, likely prior to your opponent having any opportunity to respond in kind. This unit keys off of the enslavement mechanic perfectly, because in order to trigger the Immortal's ability, you'll need to include soldier units from any of our original 7 factions in your deck. Cards similar to this one demonstrate that there will be an enormous diversity of deck building options when it comes to our Necrons, because note that this unit's ability specifies a trait as opposed to a faction, and for the cost, I think that this unit offers a pretty powerful effect. If you have a non-Necron unit at its location and really need to front load some damage, then ideally, when that non-Necron is already exhausted, you can simply sacrifice that unit in order to receive a second opportunity to attack. And if your opponent doesn't have any ranged keyword units of their own, you could potentially whittle away a considerable bit of opposition prior to the onset of traditional combat. And if the unit you sacrificed was already exhausted, meaning it would have essentially been worthless during the first round of combat, then that only serves to make that downpour of damage tokens all the more appetitive a prospect. It's difficult to gauge just how powerful a double attack from this unit may be, considering we have little idea in regard to what kind of events and attachments the Necrons may receive as a means of augmenting their various combat units, and further, we have next to no idea what kind of card effects the 2 upcoming Necron warlords and their associated signature squads may also provide. But when it comes to soldier trait units, there are a tremendous number of desirable non-loyal options from various factions to draw from, and which you may want to consider including in your deck. deck. Perhaps some warlord-loving Borkon recruits end up deployed to the first planet, they deal out a considerable bit of damage, end up surviving that battle, and are subsequently swept up into your HQ. The following round, if you commit them to the same planet as sits a copy of Mandragoran Immortals, your soldier will show up exhausted, and if you need to, you can discard them in order to afford yourself a second attack, potentially allowing you multiple opportunities to remove the most problematic present enemy units. Blood Angels Veterans are another desirable, durable alternative, and so too are the rather affordable Talarn Raiders and Area Effect 1 possessing Tactical Squad Cardenas. Really, from this moment onward, anytime we see a printed, non-loyal, non-Tyranid unit, it's going to be yet another deck slot contender for the prospective Necron player to consider. And though a pool of 3 hit points may feel somewhat wasted when spent on a relatively expensive ranged unit, it at least helps guarantee that the Mandragoran Immortals are unlikely to be removed from play by some card effect which confers even a moderate amount of damage. But in attempting to run through this veritable monsoon of spoilers relatively concisely, let's move on to another traditional army unit, the Reanimating Warriors. A second instance of a 3-cost army, this unit has 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, and only 2 hit points. It has the Warrior trait and Interrupt. When this unit would be destroyed by taking damage, remove all damage from it, and move this unit to an adjacent planet instead. Limit once per phase. So, this is expensive for the stats, but is likely to prove difficult to permanently destroy. When it would be destroyed through damage, whether through an attack or some kind of damaging deleterious card effect, you can instead opt to relocate your warriors to the adjacent planet of your choice, and in doing so, expunge this unit of all present damage tokens. Though this ability is limited to once per phase, it nevertheless affords you the opportunity to have one unit potentially engage and participate in multiple battles during the same game round, or instead, to perhaps simply endure upon being seemingly destroyed, persisting round after round, potentially moving from a battle at the first planet to what will become the following round's first planet, and then to indefinitely repeat this process for the remaining duration of the game. So, while it isn't a very formidable body for the price, it could easily provide a significant bit of value, and though it's not exactly invincible, it does seem like it may come reasonably close, and is most definitely not going to be a priority target for your opponent, unless it was already destroyed once that phase, which is something that could certainly result in its being able to deal out significant chunks of damage to your opposition, while in return remaining relatively unmolested. I think it's certainly worth noting that there's no reason to believe that the state of this unit, that is, whether it's ready or exhausted, will change upon its not actually being destroyed and being moved to an adjacent location, but it still looks as though the Reanimating Warriors could be incredibly useful, and they even have a command icon so that upon relocation to another planet, even if it doesn't get involved in a follow-up combat, it'll be able to contribute at least something to your winning additional cards and resources during the following round. So, whether or not this someday proves itself to be an immensely stubborn and frustrating unit does remain to be seen, but for the time being, I absolutely love this escape from death mechanic, and this is a sterling example of Necron faction survivability. It also seems like a rather convenient means of shutting down enemy card effects along the lines of Captain Cato Sicarius' resource generation ability, because, as it's printed pointed relocation effect takes place instead of these warriors being destroyed, our Ultramarines trait Warlord is presented with no triggering condition from which to derive benefit from his reaction. Still, if despite your best of efforts your reanimating warriors do somehow find their way into your discard pile, perhaps most often by a card effect which destroys units without the need to do so through damage, our third common army unit is another mechanically elegant means of illustrating the Necron faction's disposition toward indestructibility. It is the Tec Scarab Swarm. For the cost of 1 resource, it has no command icons, but an attack value of 2, as well as 2 hit points. It has the drone trait and reads Interrupt. When this unit is destroyed, return a target Necron unit from your discard pile to your hand. So, it won't help you to win command struggles, but it packs a considerable punch, and can survive at least 1 point of damage. But, more importantly, it does so for a nearly unbeatable price, and further will help you to return more valuable units to play. But whether those units are meant to serve you in combat, or simply instead meant to bolster your economy, so long as it's a Necron in your discard pile, you can recur that unit to your hand. So, whether that unit had been destroyed, or it was simply discarded, perhaps as a result of a card effect like that associated with the planet Barlas, the Tec Scarab Swarm gives you an opportunity to put that unit back into play once the Scarab Swarm itself is destroyed. So, if your opponent is adamantly against destroying these units, then you might not be able to benefit from that discard pile recursion. But so long as you do deploy the Scarab Swarm to the first planet, or one likely to hold host to the side of a battle, I think an enemy is unlikely to pass up on capturing planets or activating battle abilities just to avoid activating this unit's interrupt. Plus, as this is a drone, one of the common non-Necron faction units you might opt to include in your deck is the Tau Earthcast Technician, which could help fetch you your Scarab Swarms. And not only are these a cheap, entirely reasonable combat unit to put into play, when destroyed under any circumstance or through any kind of card effect, they look like they could work wonders to help replenish your ranks of other available Necrons. All the same, while the Scarab Swarms aren't enormously powerful, we also see spoiled one upcoming Necron Elite, which similarly interacts with one's discard pile. It is the Harbinger of Eternity. For the cost of 5 resources, it has 3 command icons, an attack value of 3, and a reservoir of 5 hit points. It has the Scholar and Elite traits and text. You may play each Necron event card from your discard pile as if it were in your hand. Forced reaction. After you play a Necron event card from your discard pile, remove that card from the game. So, this is yet another fascinating new card with incredible possibilities. For the price that you're paying, its statistics aren't exactly stellar, but it can still inflict a moderate amount of damage upon attacking, and can endure a significant bit of punishment. It could readily surpass an enemy's 2 command icon unit when deployed to a planet in order to potentially help win you command struggles single-handedly, but the primary allure of this unit is, as always, going to be in its ability. After you play an event card from your hand, you can play it again, direct from your discard pile. That event does happen to be removed from the game upon your doing so, and this is the first time we've seen a card with that kind of effect. But considering that there exists no present means of returning events to one's hand, that hardly seems like any actual drawback. And in some ways, as we'll explore shortly, depleting one's discard pile pile of cards can actually be of some benefit. So, as with any elite, this unit is entirely eligible to be saved from destruction by the neutral event Fall Back, which Necrons themselves are also entirely eligible to play, and later we'll cover an additional neutral event, one to be released in this very deluxe expansion, which could work wonders in preserving the well-being of this elite unit. But unless we can expect significant development of the Scholar trait, so much of the power and utility inherent to this unit is going to rely completely upon which Necron events we see developed. And in straying from my usual pattern of covering army units, attachments, supports, and events in that order, let's instead take a look at the two Necron event examples included within this article. First, we have Reanimation Protocol. For 0 resources, this event has one shield icon as well as the tactic trait. It reads Action. Remove up to 2 damage from a Necron unit you control. Max 1 per round. So, if you possess a damaged Necron unit, you can strip a couple of damage tokens off of it. This event then enters your discard pile upon its being resolved, and the following round you can use the ability of your Harbinger of Eternity to play this event again, and considering the cost of 0 resources, this is a very affordable and in some cases indeed reusable ability. So, while it may not always make an enormous bit of difference, considering you'll be shielding units and that you might be running multiple 3+ hit point Necrons, such as our aforementioned Mandragoran Immortals, this could nevertheless end up being considerably useful. Still, it's a shame that you can't use this event on any non-Necron unit, and as a result, this certainly suggests that the prospective Necron deck builder is going to have to strike a careful balance between just how many Necron and other faction units they do ultimately decide to include in their decks. But this article also unveils a second Necron event in the aptly named Extermination. For the monumental expense of 5 resources, this is regardless likely to be a devastating event, one with significant likely to be game-altering consequences. With one shield icon and the tactic trait, this event reads Deploy Action. Each non-unique, non-Necron unit at a target planet gets -3 HP until the end of the phase. You must pass during your next deployment turn. So, akin to Exterminatus, Doom, Consumption, and Warpstorm, this is the Necron iteration of an incredible catch-up event. If your opponent has piled high units at any individual planet, though you must pass at the next available opportunity after playing this event during the deploy phase, Extermination could nevertheless allow you to obliterate any number of enemy army units while preserving all of your own. This is yet another effect which suggests that a Necron player will have to gauge how many other faction units to include in their decks very carefully indeed, and further, you'll want to be rather selective in regard to when and where you deploy your non-Necrons. But provided you do have an appetitive planetary target and that you don't mind investing so many resources, all non-Necrons that are not unique lose 3 hit points until the end of the phase, and this is the kind of card effect that cannot be shielded against, so therefore any 3 or lower HP unit is immediately destroyed and discarded. If you have the initiative token and a wounded Tyrannid unit has an attached copy of Regeneration, your opponent may not have the opportunity to use one of their deploy actions to exhaust their attachment and remove those existing damage tokens prior to your playing this event in the time that elapsed between their readying that attachment during their headquarters phase and the onset of the deploy phase. And because this is a card effect which does not deal damage, it simply removes hit points, a Blood Angels Veterans dies as does any other 3 HP unit. And because this is also clearly not an attack from a unit, an opponent's Volatile Pyrovore has no target at which to direct direct damage, and an Honored Librarian has no means of conveniently avoiding this effect. Plus, although this ephemeral HP reduction only persists until the end of the deploy phase, which means that all 4+ HP units essentially appear as if entirely unaffected by this event, once the deploy phase has passed, Extermination has no effect whatsoever on present Necron units, meaning that if you possessed any number of animate war machines stationed at that target planet, potentially serving as bait to lure your opponent to deploy heavily upon that planet, all of your present Necrons will remain entirely preserved, which, especially considering our current high unit volume, low hit point contemporary meta, means that one Extermination alone could easily expunge a target planet of your opponent's entire army, though this will not affect Necrons or any other faction's unique units specifically. So, though this is far less useful during a Necron faction mirror match than it would ever otherwise be, it regardless has incredible potential, and you are readily able to use this event to target the first planet. Therefore, it makes me think that a first planet bullying aggressive style strategy may be advisable in some cases if you're going up against certain kinds of Necron players, just because if your units are relegated to your HQ, then they'll be safe from the devastation wrought by this event, though in that case, they will, after the deploy phase, show up at a planet exhausted, and could therefore fall prey to being rent apart on a molecular level by the potent Gauss weaponry of any number of Necrons. So, perhaps this affords most opponents a bit of a catch-22 situation, but whether or not this enormous investment all poured into one single solitary card effect does ultimately prove worth it, regardless, it is one hell of an event afforded to Necrons. But with our army unit and event card types both now thoroughly covered, we're on to attachments, and first we have the Mind Shackle Scarab. So, in following with a Necron theme of slavery and subdual, this is a 3-cost attachment with 1 shield icon, the drone trait, and reads attached to a non-elite army unit. Action: if attached unit's faction symbol matches your enslaved faction, exhaust this attachment to gain control of attached unit until the end of the phase. So this is a fascinating attachment. It is expensive, but it does not count as war gear, and therefore can be affixed to various vehicles, but it can never be attached to elites. At the beginning of the deploy phase, you can always set your enslavement dial to whatever one non-Tyranid faction you'd like, whether it matches that of a common unit in your hand that you'd like to deploy, or if instead you set your dial with the specific intent to match that of your opponent's desirable unit. Generally, you'll want to play this attachment upon your opponent's most powerful or threatening unit, and then, during the deploy phase, effectively commandeer it. This card effect only persists until the end of the phase, but it can cause an incredible shift in regard to which player appears likely to end up winning a battle, because, for the price of 3 resources, you effectively immediately remove an enemy's most formidable and dangerous non-elite unit from the opponent's half of the equation of combat. Instead, you gain it yourself. By pursuing a specific desired enemy army unit, being intent on playing this attachment could compromise your ability to deploy enslaved faction units from hand, but this could nevertheless set back your opponent far more significantly than it could you. So long as you do have a desirable target to steal, causing a 1-unit shift can make a tremendous difference, especially if you happen to be sitting opposite a player with a predilection for playing attachments upon their units. So, again, the Mind Shackle Scarab may appear at first quite expensive, but it essentially works as single target removal. Granted, your opponent won't want to destroy their own units so that they might be able to regain control of it upon conclusion of the phase, but sometimes your enemy won't be left with a choice, as abandoning a decisive planet or one otherwise integral to their victory condition may not be an option. And keep in mind that if your only remaining unit at a planet does happen to be that which you stole, because attacking with one's units is never an option, your opponent may have no choice but to gun down their own unit, and even if they don't, and it ends up surviving, only to shake off your ephemeral control, you can simply regain command of that unit at some point the following round. All the same, depending upon which specific unit you target to steal, you might be able to remove it from play regardless. For instance, if you take control of a copy of Zarathar's Flamers, instead of your opponent being able to attack with it and then sacrifice it as an action to deliver additional damage, instead, you may not only deprive your enemy of that attack plus card effect ability, but prior to your losing control of that unit at the end of the phase, if you end up sacrificing it yourself, then you stand to prevent your opponent from having anything to regain control of. Just remember that this effect is clearly telegraphed to your adversary, and in the case of those Flamers, they could trigger that action prior to your commanding control, just to squeeze as much lingering value from that unit as possible. So, the Mind Shackle Scarabs look entirely playable in theory, but I'm very curious to see how they will function in practical terms. The potential is there most definitely, but the non-elite stipulation does give me some pause, and especially considering we're due to receive a wealth of elite support in this expansion, and as our card pool continues to develop, I remain exceptionally curious to see the true potential behind this potentially game-swinging attachment. But perhaps one of the most famous and iconic bits of tabletop 40k Necron war gear happens to be portrayed exquisitely in our second and last to be unveiled attachment, the Resurrection Orb. For the cost of 2 resources, it has 2 shield icons and possesses the war gear trait. It reads, attached to an elite Necron unit you control. Reaction. After a combat round at this planet begins, if the topmost card of your discard pile is a non-elite Necron unit, put it into play at this planet. So this is incredible. So long as you possess an elite trait Necron, such as our previously revealed Harbinger of Eternity, this affords you an indescribably powerful opportunity to overcome your opposition. If you thought that Broderick War's signature forward barracks was powerful in that it puts a guardsman token into play at the end of each combat round, if an inanimate object could do so, the Resurrection Orb would laugh in the metaphorical face of that support. Each and every time a combat round begins, not ends, at the planet where you possess the attached elite, if the top card of your discard pile is a non-elite Necron, you put it into play. So, while your opponent will undoubtedly prioritize killing the attached unit, if you can take them by surprise with your playing out this attachment, for as many combat rounds as you can keep your elite alive, you could potentially return common Necron army units to play, and should the topmost card of your discard pile perhaps be an event instead of an army unit, you can use your same Harbinger of Eternity to play that event from your discard pile, which removes it from the game, and therefore it slightly rearranges the order of cards so that you may well be able to guarantee you can put a common Necron unit into play at the onset of each combat round. So, while you're foregoing a 2 shield value card by deploying this attachment, it nevertheless affords you an incredible opportunity to recur your discarded or destroyed Necron units, and putting them directly into play, ready at the beginning of combat, meaning that they can immediately participate, could be unfathomably powerful in leveraging numbers in your favor, particularly considering just how difficult to remove your typical Necrons can be. And note also that you can wait to play this attachment until the topmost card of your discard pile is in fact a common Necron. Granted, your opponent can attempt to play around this effect, for instance, by using a card effect to outright destroy one of your enslaved non-Necron faction units that will alter the arrangement of your discard pile ever so slightly. And similarly, near the end of a combat round, your opponent can simply opt to try to kill off one of your common non-Necron faction units, both of which end up disallowing you from taking advantage of the Resurrection Orb in order to put a common Necron unit into play. So, another card with remarkable potential, yet not something impossible to play around. All the same, it's something which has me extraordinarily excited about the prospect of playing Necrons, and I can scarcely wait to see our remaining animate construct elites. As a simple point of comparison, the Great Devourer Deluxe Expansion included 5 different elite options for Tyranids, so consider me very excited about the possibilities indeed. Still, in bringing our initial Necron unveil to a close, we still possess 2 supports prior to our taking a look at the partial spoiler-laden card fans and individual reveals for our neutral and non-Necron factions. The first of these supports is the Particle Whip. For the cost of 3 resources, it has the artillery and upgrade traits, as well as headquarters action. Exhaust this support and shuffle any number of unit cards from your discard pile into your deck to deal X damage to a target non-elite army unit. X is the number of cards shuffled into your deck. So this is a potentially powerful effect, but it strikes me as a somewhat unusual card, because while you could deal enormous amounts of damage to a target non-elite enemy army unit by merit of their being so difficult to destroy, army units like the Reanimating Warriors may be unlikely to end up in your discard pile, and thanks to card effects like that of the Tec Scarab Swarm, those units that are in your discard pile may not actually be there for long. So, while this could deal out considerable amounts of damage and provide pinpoint target elimination geared toward removing specific problematic enemy army units, the Particle Whip is limited to a once per round effect, can only occur during the headquarters phase, and that damage is shieldable. And I think that between how expensive this support is and how unlikely it may be to successfully deal out significant amounts of unprevented damage, unless we see some kind of card effect that allows you to conveniently mill your own deck and potentially flood your discard pile with units, perhaps something along the lines of opting to enslave one or more copies of Beeltan Warp Spiders and potentially using their ability to target yourself, or perhaps if you can benefit from copious amounts of card draw at some point, then through deploying the unique neutral unit Inquisitor Caius Roth, you could not only deplete your opponent's hand of cards, but also your own, which could provide you with an opportunity to effectively transform those same discarded units into points of damage dealt out to one target enemy army unit, or multiple target enemy army units, albeit over multiple game rounds. So, an unusual support to be sure, one of which I don't exactly approve of the phase-limited timing, but it's also an interesting means of returning spent cards from one's discard pile back into your deck, so that those same units could potentially be drawn and subsequently played once again. But of all cards thus far, certainly consider me most skeptical of this one. Still, Well, as the very last of our complete Necron spoilers, our second support is one far more affordable. At a cost of 1, we see Tec Complex. It has the location trait and the limited keyword. It reads Reaction. After you deploy a unit from a non-Necron faction, if you control no other units from that faction, gain 1 resource or draw 1 card. So this seems an approximate equivalent to the 7 existing faction-specific army unit resource cost-reducing supports, but it is not unique and does not provide any economy bonus from playing Necron specifically. Instead, it encourages you to engage in slavery, rewarding your doing so with your pick of a card or resource, dependent entirely upon what you're most wanting at that time. But this does promote deck building and enslavement dial selecting diversity, and that you can not only derive benefit if you have no other units of that deployed unit's faction already in play. So, during a given deploy phase, you can only pick 1 faction to play units from on your enslavement dial, and if you play multiple non-Necrons of that same faction on the same turn, though you need not exhaust this support to benefit, you're essentially limited to nevertheless triggering this 1 time per round at most, unless you ambush another unit of that faction into play after all of your other units belonging to that faction have been destroyed or discarded. All the same, the benefit of an additional card drawn, presumably each and every round, provided that you've included a significant number of non-Necrons, is considerable, and the longer a game endures, the better. So, despite being limited, considering this is not unique, and therefore you're not too harshly penalized for including multiple copies of this in your deck, this support seems reasonably powerful and therefore is certainly advisable at the very least to experiment with. And altogether, I think this frankly seems something reasonably likely to see competitive play, especially if deploying elites or myriad ambush keyword units becomes prominent, because apart from that presumably seldom to occur latter situation, I think that you're unlikely to have the opportunity or resources to play or derive benefit from more than 1 non-Necron being deployed per turn. But with those cards covered, we've essentially seen the full extent of our Necron faction spoilers, though I'm convinced it's only a matter of time before Fantasy Flight Games unveils our 2 upcoming Necron warlords, and going off of what we've seen thus far, I cannot wait to see their abilities. But before concluding this video, we've still some information to process, and the first is a neutral event which changes the face of Conquest LCG as we know it forever. For the cost of 1 resource, we have Backlash. It has 1 shield icon and the tactic trait. It reads Interrupt. When your opponent triggers an ability that targets an elite unit you control, cancel its effects. Then, if that ability was triggered from an army unit, destroy it. So, wow, I can scarcely begin to describe how powerful in effect this is. Up until the moment that this card was spoiled, the general community consensus was to scoff at the prospect of playing elite-heavy decks, specifically because traditionally, expensive elite trait units have been so easily countered by myriad different card effects. If you invest 8 resources in a formidable Black Legion Helldrake, your opponent can simply pay 2 resources and immediately rout that unit with Archon's Terror. It's banished from a planet immediately, and if that was the decisive game-deciding conflict, then that's the end of your outrageously expensive unit. And even if it wasn't, it'd be showing up the following round exhausted alongside one's warlord, only to potentially be picked picked apart by your opponent prior to even attempting to earn back any of its invested resources for you. But now, if you play out an intimidating elite, no matter what faction you're running, for 1 resource and 1 card, you can use this neutral event to counter whatever ability your opponent directs against you. Archon's Terror is cancelled, but your opponent is still out those resources and a card of their own. Inquisitorial Fortress is still destroyed in attempting to rout your unit, but its effect is cancelled as well. And if your opponent attempts to use the ability associated with an army unit against you, that effect is not just cancelled, but the offending unit is outright destroyed. If your opponent has the audacity to dare to invest 4 resources in a Clavex War Leader, hoping to ambush it into play and in doing so decapitate your necessarily wounded elite, you negate that effect entirely and immediately outright destroy that unit. The card that so many players once considered to have made the Dark Eldar faction utterly broken is now a tremendous liability because of the mere existence of this card. So, while the Clavex War Leader could still enjoy its reign of terror when employed against 4 or lower cost unit, as soon as it dares to trigger its when ambushed style card effect against an elite, its controller runs the risk of immediately losing a total of 4 resources and 1 card worth of investment. But also, this effect could destroy a copy of Sicarius's Chosen if it attempts to damage and in doing so relocate one of your elites. And similarly, it could outright obliterate an enemy's Captain Marcus if they sacrifice a unit in attempt to exhaust one of your elites. And note that in that case, the unit remains sacrificed, but the exhaustion is what's countered. Plus, because that card effect stemmed from an army unit despite his being unique, Captain Marcus is eliminated from play immediately and entirely. So, for such a readily affordable cost, this is an incredible card, and certainly stands alone to potentially make elites immediately viable. All of a sudden, players are going to have to consider their ability targets very carefully indeed if one of their present possible options happens to be an elite. So I could scarcely be more pleased by the existence of this card, and if the Necrons weren't already enough to alter our existing meta forever, then this card is most definitely looking to do so. You just want to ensure that, in entering the combat phase, you do ensure that you keep at least 1 resource available. But, as the last of our complete spoilers, we're also granted the preview of an upcoming unit for the Astra Militarum. Each of the 7 non-Necron factions stands to receive a new common unit in the Legions of Death Deluxe Expansion, and the AM iteration is the Standardbearer. It has a cost of 3 resources and comes with 1 command icon. It has an attack value of 2, as well as 2 printed hit points. It has the Soldier trait and text. While you control a non-Astra Militarum warlord, you may deploy this unit from your hand as if it had ambush. Reaction: after this unit enters play, ready an army unit you control at this planet. So, when you're deciding what manner of deck in which to run this unit, your primary contenders are presumably any non-Necron warlord, any Space Marine, any Orc, or Commander Starblaze, because clearly, whether enslaved, allied, or perhaps simply adopting the role of a Gaivesa, in any case you'll possess a non-AM warlord, which allows this granted expensive unit the option of ambush. But with Colonel Strachan or Broderick War, this 3-cost unit could attack for 3, but definitely more appealing than its stats, considering its cost, is that ability. If you have exhausted units at a planet, you can ready one, and more than being ambushed into play at the end of a combat round so that it can do a presumable 2 points of damage, the ability to ready any one of your army units, regardless of faction or cost, can be incredibly useful. Perhaps you attacked with an elite, or in any case your most dangerous present attacker. If your opponent spent all of their own combat turns in attempt to kill off your still ready units, leaving combat capable units still present, albeit exhausted near the end of the combat round, you can immediately make them regret their decision in doling out enormous amounts of presumably unexpected damage to your opposition. Likely 2 from this unit, and then a probably considerable amount from another, so long as you do have another present army unit. Plus, considering it's a soldier, if you're playing a Necron faction warlord, you could ambush this unit into play, ready one of your army units, attack with this unit, attack with your recently readied army unit, and then discard Standardbearer to a Mandragoran Immortals in order to ready that unit and launch an additional attack. And when this soldier trait unit leaves play because of your Immortals, you could even replace it with 1 or more copies of Elysian Assault Team, which would stand to grant you all the more additional 2-value attacks. So, considering you're generally unlikely to have any units exhausted during the deploy phase, this is more than likely not an army unit intended for any of our existing range of Astra Militarum warlords, but it could easily find a welcome home when played as part of a Space Marine or Orc deck as well. So this is definitely a provocative unit, and perhaps more than anything else, when it comes to our primarily Necron expansion set, we may well be seeing myriad other common units, many of which, like the Necrons themselves, perhaps encourage players to run a whole host of out-of-faction units. But in bringing this review to a regrettable close, we are afforded a peek at 2 different card fans. Our first clearly displays what the Necron enslavement dial will look like, and is composed largely of cards we've already seen spoiled, but we are given the name of our first of 2 Necron warlords, which is Onrakir the Traveler. His ability is partially spoiled, and we don't know his stats, but he possesses a deploy action which, though somewhat obscured, may read deploy the topmost army unit card in a target player's discard pile, limit once per phase. And if that is the case, that is a fantastic ability which affords the Necron player all the more mid-game play diversity, and allows them an even greater range of options to consider when it comes to what they should select with their enslavement dial each deploy phase. The ability to play out some of your opponent's most valuable units direct from their discard pile, if that is indeed what this ability does, could be fantastic. But then again, so too could be resurrecting some of your own units. But as we cannot clearly discern the exact text of that ability, I will abstain from any additional speculation until such time as we do receive our inevitable full reveal. Still, our first card fan shows most of the art for the Destroyer Cultist, which we can tell is a signature army unit, but apart from that, we can glean essentially no additional information, save for discerning the word control. But we also have a second card fan, which again shows off Backlash and Standardbearer, but we're also afforded a glimpse at 2 additional upcoming common units. For Tau, we have the Aircast Courier for a cost of 2, with a command icon, an attack value of 1, and 3 printed hit points, which appears as if it can conditionally gain the flying keyword, and perhaps move one player's attacking unit. Then, as our final card, we see an upcoming Tyrannid faction army unit, the 2-cost Swarmling Termagants. But apart from the creature and Leviathan traits, and somehow involving Termagant tokens, we know nothing else about this unit. But now that we've reviewed our latest article in its entirety, that brings this Legions of Death article review video to a close. Please let me know in the comments what you think of our upcoming Necrons faction and all of these intriguing new cards to be released in our upcoming second deluxe expansion for Conquest LCG. How are the Necrons looking to fare relative to our existing 7 options, and how might they tentatively rank in regard to competitive power tier? Which of these cards are you most and least excited about, and what are your initial impressions of the Necrons faction mechanics? Do you think that our neutral event Backlash will alter the composition of the dominant meta forever? Be sure to share your opinion below, and do tell me just what your hopes and dreams are for the release of this expansion and the inevitable eventual reveal of our upcoming Necron warlords, in addition to any or all of the cards I discussed today. So, in closing, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and once again, if you enjoyed this content, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you've not done so already, or if you are already subscribed, you're always encouraged to share this content, as the more people there are out there that end up exposed to Conquest, the more individuals may serve to give this game a try, enjoy what they experience, and someday join our community. And of course, all together, we continue to send the message to Fantasy Flight Games to continue to support and to develop for this fantastic product. If at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, I would encourage you to do so through Twitter or on Facebook, and if you ever feel so inclined to help support the Hive Tyrant, I would be honored and humbled were you to donate to my Patreon. But once again, thank you so much for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.